Alright, how's it going guys? So welcome back to another post-practice video, and as you can see, this time we're in traditional, so I finally got a setup that actually allows me to record in traditional, and I've actually streamed some traditional drawing before, so if you're interested in that, be sure to check out the streams. But I don't draw in traditional that often anymore because it's just a lot more convenient to do stuff in digital, especially because a lot of the stuff that I do has to go on social media. It's just a lot more convenient to only do stuff in digital. But I used to draw quite a bit in traditional before I went digital, so this is not exactly new. Which is also why I'm using well, it's part of the reason why I'm using a fine liner instead of a pencil. Because I'm still kind of used to how traditional works, so I don't necessarily need to erase my lines. And the other reason is because it's just, it shows up a lot clearer on video than a pencil would, so yeah. That's basically why I'm using this, and I guess the other reason is also for practice purposes, because if you're drawing with a pen that you can't erase, you kind of have to really think about where your lines are going. Especially if you look closely at what I'm doing, a lot of the time I'm actually kind of ghosting the line that I want to draw, or basically bringing the pencil over and kind of putting a dot where I want my form to be, like what I do right here with the hand. I basically measured it out from the shoulder and then placed the dot there, and then that showed me that the hand should be over there. But if you draw a lot in traditional, I would highly recommend doing it like that, where instead of, you know, just immediately drawing the line, mark where you want your lines to be, or ghost the line first and then actually make your mark. It's going to save you a lot of headache, as well as make your drawings just faster, because you have to erase less and less and everything will just be in the correct spot immediately. And actually, I would also kind of recommend ghosting your lines like that in digital, because it gets you thinking about what the line that you want to draw should look like. So instead of going on autopilot, you have to think about what the line should look like. Anyway, that was a pretty long tangent. So I'm keeping my figures pretty simple because I'm drawing in traditional. If you've seen the previous post-practice videos, I sometimes make these figures a bit more complicated, or I guess a bit more detailed, whereas right now I'm just keeping them as very simple stick figure like drawings, I guess. But at the same time, that's also because that's what I'm practicing right now, simplifying things to these very I guess, simplified gestural forms. Later in the video, I do actually make these drawings a bit more detailed, and I actually draw like actual characters on top of them, so if that's what you're interested in, you can skip ahead to the end. But for these poses, as you can see, I usually start off by getting that line of action, which is, I guess, kind of the line that shows you how the different body parts are connected to each other. So the line from the head down to the rib cage, down to the pelvis, and then it follows the legs usually. But I start off with that, and then on that line, I usually mark the proportions. So in this case, I'm using characters that are 8 heads tall. My references are not 8 heads tall. I'm just making the figures 8 heads tall because it's a lot easier to practice doing that than using figures that are 7.5 heads tall, for example. Because with 8 heads, it's actually pretty easy to divide everything in half, because if you find the midway point of the body, you've got exactly 4 heads above that and 4 heads below that, and then you can split that in half again and split it in half again to get the 8 proportions. Then the bottom of the knees can be found exactly halfway in between the crotch as well as the bottom of the feet, and I did recently upload a longer video about proportions, so if you're interested in learning more about that, you can check that out. But yeah, start off with the line of action, then mark out where you want the proportions to be, and then from there you can draw the figure on top. This also kind of only works with characters that are standing straight up. Well, not just characters that are standing straight up, but they can also be sitting down. But just as long as things aren't heavily foreshortened, which is why I'm not using those kinds of poses. I think before you move on to the heavily foreshortened poses, you do have to be comfortable drawing these regular poses. Otherwise, you're just making things a lot harder for yourself than they need to be. Because I've seen a lot of beginner artists, even in our Discord server, whenever they're doing or practicing figure drawing, they sometimes choose poses that are so difficult that I would think even professional artists would struggle with it, and I don't think you can get that much practice out of using those difficult poses, because when you're practicing a pose, you have to actually know what you're trying to learn from that pose, whether that be you're trying to learn the gesture, you're trying to get better at drawing the proportions, the anatomy, the perspective, anything like that. And the more difficult the pose is, the harder it's going to be for you to actually learn something from drawing that pose, because most of the time you're just going to be struggling with actually drawing the pose properly, instead of being able to think about how you should proportion the pose or how the gesture for this pose should look like. So yeah, just start off with relatively easy poses, and then once you've mastered those, that's when you can move on to the slightly more advanced poses, like people laying down, sitting down, and then once you've mastered those, you move on to poses where people are actually moving, and then once you've mastered those, practice how to draw people standing up properly in perspective, and then once you're good at that, that's when you can actually move on to doing very dynamic shots. Something else you may have noticed is that in the previous drawing I did, the reference that I used was a woman, whereas the actual drawing is a bit more masculine. And that's another thing that I've been practicing, the difference between male and female bodies. So essentially what I've been doing to practice that is I take a reference of either a man or a woman, and then I basically make the drawing the opposite in terms of like features. At some point I should also start to do that with actual proportions, or I guess with head proportions. So for example, take a reference of an adult and then draw a child body using that reference. I think that would also be a pretty good exercise. Maybe for the next video I'll do something like that, where I have a reference and then I kind of change the proportions on it. I think that would be kind of a disaster, but I'm curious to see how that would turn out. Now this last pose was surprisingly difficult because with the way he's moving his body, his rib cage is kind of leaning backwards, and then his pelvis is coming out forwards, legs are kind of crouched down, and then of course his head is going into his chest, which means you have to make sure that the head overlaps the trapezius and the shoulders, which is always a pretty difficult thing to get right because it makes the balance kind of weird. And I've said on stream before that that's something I need to practice, and I still haven't done it. So after this, it's definitely something that I need to start doing pretty soon. And I think the main issue that I had with this pose is I got the initial line of action wrong, or at the very least I didn't properly consider what the legs were doing, and that kind of threw them out of proportion, made them a bit too long, and made them a little too straight. I think if I curved that S curve, or well, if I turned it into a C curve, I think that would have been better. And at the end of the video, I kind of show what I mean by that. And sticking to the male and female differences, I try to make this body more feminine as opposed to the reference. But that's it for all of the sketches. So then I also quickly, and by quickly I mean it took a couple minutes, decided to essentially draw some more, or I guess slightly more complicated bodies on top of it in digital. I could have also done this in traditional, but I think that would have just looked a bit too cluttered, and it'd be really hard to tell what's going on, especially because I would just be using black instead of red. So yeah, it'd be a lot harder to tell what's happening. Also, I don't know what kind of practice like I've done recently, but somehow my line control feels like it's gotten a lot better. Like I actually have a lot more control over where I want my lines to go, and most of the time I can actually draw them exactly where I want them to be, except for when I'm drawing lines that go counterclockwise, specifically from, I guess, 3 o'clock to 12 o'clock. That curve in particular, going counterclockwise, is probably the hardest line that, at least for me, because I've been trying to practice it, just drawing that curve using circles as a guide, and so far it doesn't really feel like I'm getting better at it, but that might also be because it just goes against the natural tendencies of your arm. I don't know if I'm the only one struggling with that particular curve, but hey, if you're also struggling with it, let me know, That way we're not alone. It sucks because that curve from 3 o'clock to 12 o'clock is super important when it comes to drawing heads. You know, if you're trying to draw the circle for the Loomis method, or even when you're just trying to draw a regular skull, it's really important to get that curve right so you can actually properly proportion the skull. So I guess maybe I'm gonna have to spend a week practicing nothing but that curve and see if that helps. I feel like line control is one of the, well, is actually probably the most important thing that these tablet companies need to start working on, because they've been making a lot of improvements, or I guess innovations in areas like frame rate, for example, and stuff like resolution. But it still feels like you're drawing on glass. They've made like no progress in the surface texture area. I guess they do have stuff like those felt nibs, and you can also get those screen protectors that have a rougher surface to it. But even with all of those things, I feel like paper still pencil and paper still feels a lot better to draw on control-wise. So if these companies actually want to make like major advancements, I feel like that's the one thing that they need to start working on. Somehow figure out how to reproduce that paper feeling on digital. If they can do that, I don't see a reason to use a traditional ever again, because I think that's the one advantage traditional has over digital right now. It's just so much easier to control your lines when you're drawing on paper as opposed to digital. There's also the thing where you know, in traditional you don't have to zoom in and you can constantly look at the entire image, whereas in digital you can't really do that. And actually, that reminds me of another thing. I think the stylus tips are actually a little too short. This is supposed to be a pose video, and I'm talking about the drawing tablets. But yeah, I think the stylus tips are too short. If they're a bit longer, kind of like actual pencil tips, it'd probably be a lot easier to draw from without zooming in. But yeah, pretty much those two things. Make the screen have a bit of a rougher texture, and make the stylus tip a bit longer. I think that would make digital drawing a lot better than it currently is. But back to the topic of the video, I think I make the arms on my male figure a bit too long, and I think that's because the upper torso on men is a bit bigger than it is on women, and the hips are smaller. So because of that, it just kind of naturally ends up that the arms, you know, end up being longer. So that's kind of something that I'll have to start paying a bit more attention to. And then now we've come back to this pose, and I think I might actually redraw this pose off recording, and I might post it in the Discord, because I do kind of want to redo this and kind of fix some of the mistakes that I made, because it does seem like I can learn quite a bit from this pose, just purely because of how the torso is tilted. So I would actually recommend you drawing this pose yourself and see if you can get it right proportions-wise, because like with the way his head is pushed into his chest, it kind of destroys the 8 head proportion thing that I was using, because his head is not an actual, or I guess the upper part of his body is no longer exactly 4 heads tall, because his head is now kind of intersecting with his ribcage. So as a result, I ended up making the legs a bit too long, and I mean, there might have also been a bit of bad measuring on my part. I need to get a bit more precise with that, or just pay a bit more attention to it, because if those measurements in the beginning are incorrect, then it doesn't really matter what you do detail-wise, because you're working off of a bad base. It doesn't matter how you try to fix it. If the guides are incorrect, then the actual drawing is going to be incorrect as well. But on the other hand, that also means that if you spend some time and really get the guidelines correct, it means you can do pretty much whatever you want when it comes to the details, because you're drawing them on top of a correct base. So basically, just spend a lot of time getting the guidelines correct. If those are correct, the rest of the drawing is going to be good as well. And then here at the end is the slight correction that I made, where I kind of looked at the angle that the leg was going and the angle that the other leg was going, and I saw that it was slightly off. So that's something to keep in mind if you're going to draw this pose. But that basically does it for this video. Like I said, the next one is probably going to involve changing head proportions. So essentially, I guess taking an adult reference or taking a child reference and then either turning it into a child or an adult. But don't forget, you can support me on Patreon and YouTube memberships, and you can also join our Discord server if you're interested. But that does it for this video, so I guess I'll catch you all in the next one.